Æthelred the Unready, or Æthelred II, was king of the English. He was the son of King Edgar and Queen Æthelred and was only about 10 years old when his half-brother Edward was murdered. Although Æthelred was not personally suspected of participation, the murder was committed at Corfe Castle by his attendants, making it more difficult for the new king to rally the nation against the military raids by Danes, especially as the legend of Saint Edward the Martyr grew. From 991 onwards, Æthelred paid tribute, or Danegeld, to the Danish king. In 1002, Æthelred ordered a massacre of Danish settlers. In 1003, King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark invaded England, as a result of which Æthelred fled to Normandy in 1013 and was replaced by Sweyn. He would return as king, however, after Sweyn's death in 1014. Unready is a mistranslation of the Old English word unread, a twist on his name, Æthelred, meaning noble-counselled. A better translation would be ill-advised. Name. The story of Æthelred's notorious nickname, from Old English Æthelred Unread, goes a long way toward explaining how his reputation has declined through history. His first name, composed of the elements Æthiel and Adel, as in Old Saxon Athel, meaning noble, and Raed, meaning counsel or advice, is typical of the compound names of those who belong to the royal house of Wessex, and it characteristically alliterates with the names of his ancestors, like Æthelwulf, Aelfred, Edward, and Edgar. His nickname Unread is usually translated into present-day English as the Unready, though, because the present-day meaning of unready no longer resembles its ancient counterpart, this translation disguises the meaning of the Old English term. Bosworth Toller's Anglo-Saxon dictionary defines the noun unread in various ways, though it seems always to have been used pejoratively. Generally, it means evil counsel, bad plan, folly. Bosworth Toller do not record it as describing a person directly, it most often describes decisions and deeds, and once refers to the nature of Satan's deceit. The element Raed in Unread is the element in Æthelred's name which means counsel. Thus Æthelred Unread is a pun meaning noble counsel, no counsel. The nickname has alternatively been taken adjectively as ill-advised, ill-prepared, indecisive, thus Æthelred the ill-advised. The epithet would seem to describe the poor quality of advice which Æthelred received throughout his reign, presumably from those around him, specifically from the royal council, known as the Witan. Though the nickname does not suggest anything particularly respectable about the king himself, its invective is not actually focused on the king but on those around him, who were expected to provide the young king with God Raed. Unfortunately, historians, both medieval and modern, have taken less of an interest in what this epithet suggests about the king's advisors, and have instead focused on the image it creates of a blundering, misfit king. Because the nickname was first recorded in the 1180s, more than 150 years after Æthelred's death, it is doubtful that it carries any implications for how the king was seen by his contemporaries or near contemporaries. In the view of Oxford professor Chris Wickham, Æthelred was one of the most forceful kings of the 10th century, who ended the control of every one of the major magnate families over their ealdormanries in the 2 decades after 985, and although this was ultimately to prove to his disadvantage, it is significant that he maintained the strength to push all of them into private life in spite of the military crisis of the period. Early life. Sir Frank Stenton remarked that much that has brought condemnation of historians on King Æthelred may well be due in the last resort to the circumstances under which he became king. Æthelred's father, King Edgar, had died suddenly in July 975, leaving 2 young sons behind. The elder, Edward, was probably illegitimate, and was still a youth on the verge of manhood, in 975. The younger son was Æthelred, whose mother, Æthelred, Edgar had married in 964. Æthelred was the daughter of Ordgar, Ealdorman of Devon, and widow of Æthelwold, Ealdorman of East Anglia. At the time of his father's death, Æthelred could have been no more than 10 years old. As the elder of Edgar's sons, Edward, reportedly a young man given to frequent violent outbursts, probably would have naturally succeeded to the throne of England despite his young age, had not he offended many important persons by his intolerable violence of speech and behaviour. In any case, a number of English nobles took to opposing Edward's succession and to defending Æthelred's claim to the throne. Æthelred was, after all, the son of Edgar's last living wife, and no rumour of illegitimacy is known to have plagued Æthelred's birth, as it might have his elder brothers. Both boys, Æthelred certainly, were too young to have played any significant part in the political manoeuvring which followed Edgar's death. It was the brothers' supporters, and not the brothers themselves, who were responsible for the turmoil which accompanied the choice of a successor to the throne. Æthelred's cause was led by his mother and included Ælfhere, Ealdorman of Mercia and Bishop Æthelwold of Winchester, while Edward's claim was supported by Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and St. Oswald of Worcester, the Archbishop of York, among other noblemen, notably Æthelwine, Ealdorman of East Anglia, and Byrhtnoth, Ealdorman of Essex. In the end, Edward's supporters proved the more powerful and persuasive, and he was crowned king at Kingston-upon-Thames before the year was out. Edward reigned for only 3 years before he was murdered by members of his brother's household. Though we know little about Edward's short reign, we do know that it was marked by political turmoil. Edgar had made extensive grants of land to monasteries which pursued the new monastic ideals of ecclesiastical reform, but these disrupted aristocratic families' traditional patronage. The end of his firm rule saw a reversal of this policy, with aristocrats recovering their lost properties or seizing new ones. This was opposed by Dunstan, but according to Cyril Hart, the presence of supporters of church reform on both sides indicates that the conflict between them depended as much on issues of land ownership and local power as on ecclesiastical legitimacy. Adherents of both Edward and Æthelred can be seen appropriating, or recovering, monastic lands. Nevertheless, favour for Edward must have been strong among the monastic communities. When Edward was killed at Æthelred's estate at Corfe Castle in Dorset in March 978, the job of recording the event, as well as reactions to it, fell to monastic writers. Stenton offers a summary of the earliest account of Edward's murder, which comes from a work praising the life of St. Oswald of Worcester. On the surface Edward's relations with Æthelred, his half-brother, and Ælfhere, his stepmother, were friendly, and he was visiting them informally when he was killed. Æthelred's retainers came out to meet him with ostentatious signs of respect, and then, before he had dismounted, surrounded him, seized his hands, and stabbed him. So far as can be seen, the murder was planned and carried out by Æthelred's household men in order that their young master might become king. There is nothing to support the allegation, which first appears in writing more than a century later, that Queen Ælfhere had plotted her stepson's death. No one was punished for a part in the crime, and Æthelred, who was crowned a month after the murder, began to reign in an atmosphere of suspicion which destroyed the prestige of the crown. It was never fully restored in his lifetime. Nevertheless, at first, the outlook of the new king's officers and councillors seems in no way to have been bleak. According to one chronicler, the coronation of Æthelred took place with much rejoicing by the councillors of the English people. Simon Keynes notes that Byrhtnoth of Ramsey states similarly that when Æthelred was consecrated king by Archbishop Dunstan and Archbishop Oswald, there was great joy at his consecration, and describes the king in this connection as a young man in respect of years, elegant in his manners, With an attractive face and handsome appearance, Æthelred could not have been older than 13 years of age in this year. During these early years, Æthelred was developing a close relationship to Æthelwold, Bishop of Winchester, one who had supported his unsuccessful claim to the throne. When Æthelwold died, on the 1st of August 984, Æthelred deeply lamented the loss, and he wrote later in a charter from 993 that the event had deprived the country of one whose industry and pastoral care administered not only to my interest but also to that of all inhabitants of the country. Conflict with the Danes. England had experienced a period of peace after the reconquest of the Danelaw in the mid-10th century by King Edgar, Æthelred's father. However, beginning in 980, when Æthelred could not have been more than 14 years old, small companies of Danish adventurers carried out a series of coastline raids against England. Hampshire, Thanet, and Cheshire were attacked in 980, Devon and Cornwall in 981, and Dorset in 982. A period of 6 years then passed before, in 988, another coastal attack is recorded as having taken place to the southwest, though here a famous battle was fought between the invaders and the Thens of Devon. Stenton notes that, though this series of isolated raids had no lasting effect on England itself, the chief historical importance is that they brought England for the first time into diplomatic contact with Normandy. During this period, the Normans, who remembered their origins as a Scandinavian people, were well disposed to their Danish cousins who, occasionally returning from a raid on England, sought port in Normandy. This led to grave tension between the English and Norman courts, and word of their enmity eventually reached Pope John XV. The Pope was disposed to dissolve their hostility towards each other, and took steps to engineer a peace between England and Normandy, which was ratified in Rouen in 991. Battle of Maldon. However, in August of that same year, a sizable Danish fleet began a sustained campaign in the southeast of England. It arrived off Folkestone, in Kent, and made its way around the southeast coast and up the river Blackwater, coming eventually to its estuary and occupying Northey Island. About 2 kilometers west of Northey lies the coastal town of Maldon, where Byrhtnoth, ealdorman of Essex, was stationed with a company of Thens. The battle that followed between English and Danes is immortalized by the Old English poem The Battle of Maldon, which describes the doomed but heroic attempt of Byrhtnoth to defend the coast of Essex against overwhelming odds. Stenton summarizes the events of the poem. For access to the mainland the Danes, depended on a causeway, flooded at high tide, which led from Northey to the flats along the southern margin of the estuary. Before the Danes had left their camp on the island, Byrhtnoth, with his retainers and a force of local militia, had taken possession of the landward end of the causeway. Refusing a demand for tribute, shouted across the water while the tide was high, Byrhtnoth drew up his men along the bank, and waited for the ebb. As the water fell, the raiders began to stream out along the causeway, but 3 of Byrhtnoth's retainers held it against him, and at last they asked to be allowed to cross unhindered and fight on equal terms on the mainland. With what even those who admired him most called over-courage, Byrhtnoth agreed to this. The pirates rushed through the falling tide, and battle was joined. Its issue was decided by Byrhtnoth's fall. Many even of his own men immediately took to flight and the English ranks were broken. What gives enduring interest to the battle is the superb courage with which a group of Byrhtnoth's Thens, knowing that the fight was lost, deliberately gave themselves to death in order that they might avenge their lord. This was the first of a series of crushing defeats felt by the English, beaten first by Danish raiders, and later by organized Danish armies. England begins tributes in 991. Æthelred was around 24 years old. In the aftermath of Maldon, it was decided that the English should grant the tribute to the Danes that they desired, and so a gaffle of £10,000 was paid them for their peace. Yet it was presumably the Danish fleet that had beaten Bertneth at Maldon that continued to ravage the English coast from 991 to 993. In 994, the Danish fleet, which had swollen in ranks since 991, turned up the Thames estuary and headed toward London. The battle fought there was inconclusive. It was about this time that Æthelred met with the leaders of the fleet, foremost among them Olaf Tryggvason, and arranged an uneasy accord. A treaty was signed between Æthelred and Olaf that provided for seemingly civilized arrangements between the then settled Danish companies and the English government, such as regulation, settlement disputes and trade. But the treaty also stipulated that the ravaging and slaughter of the previous year would be forgotten, and ended abruptly by stating that £22,000 of gold and silver had been paid to the raiders as the price of peace. In 994, Olaf Tryggvason, already a baptized Christian, was confirmed as Christian in a ceremony at Andover. King Æthelred stood as his sponsor. After receiving gifts, Olaf promised that he would never come back to England in hostility. Olaf then left England for Norway and never returned, though other component parts of the Viking force appear to have decided to stay in England, for it is apparent from the treaty that some had chosen to enter into King Æthelred's service as mercenaries. Based presumably on the Isle of Wight, renewed Danish raids in 997, Danish raids began again. According to Keynes, there is no suggestion that this was a new fleet or army, and presumably the mercenary force created in 994 from the residue of the raiding army of 991 had turned on those whom it had been hired to protect. It harried Cornwall, Devon, western Somerset, and South Wales in 997, Dorset, Hampshire, and Sussex in 998. In 999, it raided Kent, and, in 1000, it left England for Normandy. Perhaps because the English had refused in this latest wave of attacks to acquiesce to the Danish demands for gafal or tribute, which would come to be known as Danegeld, Dane payment. This sudden relief from attack Æthelred used to gather his thoughts, resources, and armies. The fleet's departure in 1000 allowed Æthelred to carry out a devastation of Strathclyde, the motive for which is part of the lost history of the North. In 1001, a Danish fleet, perhaps the same fleet from 1000, returned and ravaged West Sussex. During its movements, the fleet regularly returned to its base in the Isle of Wight. There was later an attempted attack in the south of Devon, though the English mounted a successful defence at Exeter. Nevertheless, Æthelred must have felt at a loss, and, in the spring of 1002, the English bought a truce for £24,000. However, Keynes points out that such payments had been practiced for at least a century, and had been adopted by Alfred the Great, Charles the Bald, and many others. Indeed, in some cases it may have seemed the best available way of protecting the people against loss of life, shelter, livestock, and crops. Though undeniably burdensome, it constituted a measure for which the king could rely on widespread support. St. Bryce's Day Massacre of 1002. On 13 November 1002, Æthelred ordered the massacre of all Danish men in England to take place on 13 November 1002. St. Bryce's Day. No order of this kind could be carried out in more than a third of England, where the Danes were too strong, but Gunhilda, sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, was said to have been among the victims. It is likely that a wish to avenge her was a principal motive for Sweyn's invasion of Western England the following year. By 1004 Sweyn was in East Anglia, where he sacked Norwich. In this year, a nobleman of East Anglia, Ulfsitil Snilling, met Sweyn in force, and made an impression on the until then rampant Danish expedition. Though Ulfsitil was eventually defeated outside of Thetford, he caused the Danes heavy losses and was nearly able to destroy their ships. The Danish army left England for Denmark in 1005, perhaps because of their injuries sustained in East Anglia, perhaps from the very severe famine which afflicted the continent and the British Isles in that year. An expedition the following year was bought off in early 1007 by tribute money of £36,000, and for the next 2 years England was free from attack. In 1008, the government created a new fleet of warships, organized on a national scale, but this was weakened when one of its commanders took to piracy, and the king and his council decided not to risk it in a general action. In Stenton's view, the history of England in the next generation was really determined between 1009 and 1012. The ignominious collapse of the English defence caused a loss of morale which was irreparable. The Danish army of 1009, led by Thorkel the Tall and his brother Hemming, was the most formidable force to invade England since Æthelred became king. It harried England until it was bought off by £48,000 in April 1012. Invasion of 1013. Sweyn then launched an invasion in 1013 intending to crown himself King of England, during which he proved himself to be a general greater than any other Viking leader of his generation. By the end of 1013 English resistance had collapsed and Sweyn had conquered the country, forcing Æthelred into exile in Normandy. But the situation changed suddenly when Sweyn died on 3 February 1014. The crews of the Danish ships in the Trent that had supported Sweyn immediately swore their allegiance to Sweyn's son Cnut the Great. But leading English noblemen sent a deputation to Æthelred to negotiate his restoration to the throne. He was required to declare his loyalty to them, to bring in reforms regarding everything that they disliked, and to forgive all that had been said and done against him in his previous reign. The terms of this agreement are of great constitutional interest in early English history, as they are the first recorded pact between a king and his subjects, and are also widely regarded as showing that many English noblemen had submitted to Sweyn simply because of their distrust of Æthelred. Æthelred then launched an expedition against Cnut and his allies, the men of the Kingdom of Lindsey. Cnut's army had not completed its preparations, and, in April 1014, he decided to withdraw from England without a fight, leaving his Lindsey allies to suffer Æthelred's revenge. In August 1015, he returned to find a complex and volatile situation unfolding in England. Æthelred's son, Edmund Ironside, had revolted against his father and established himself in the Danelaw, which was angry at Cnut and Æthelred for the ravaging of Lindsey and was prepared to support Edmund in any uprising against both of them.